September 2, 1945, the port of Yokohama lay in ruins, its once bustling harbor now silent except for the distant hum of American patrol boats cutting through the gray waters. Captain Robert Halloway stood on the deck of the USS Comfort, watching the smoke still rising from what remained of the Japanese mainland. At 28 years old, he had seen more devastation than most men would witness in a lifetime, but nothing had prepared him for what awaited him in the weeks to come. Among the chaos of surrender, occupation and the massive displacement of millions, a forgotten group would emerge from the shadows of war, women who had worn the uniform of the Imperial Japanese Army, now prisoners in a conflict that had just ended. Their stories would challenge everything Halloway thought he understood about duty, humanity, and the true cost of war. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Robert Halloway had never intended to become a soldier, much less an officer responsible for the welfare of enemy prisoners. He had grown up in Portland, Oregon, the son of a lumber mill foreman and a schoolteacher mother who filled their modest home with books and music. The Depression had touched their family lightly compared to others. His father had kept his job through the worst years, and young Robert had grown up with a sense that hard work and fair dealing would see a man through any crisis. He was in his second year at Reed College, studying literature and dreaming vaguely of becoming a teacher like his mother, when the news came over the radio on that December Sunday in 1941. Pearl Harbor changed everything. Within a week, Robert had withdrawn from college and enlisted in the Army. His education and aptitude tests marked him for officer candidate school, and by the spring of 1942, he found himself at Fort Benning, learning the arts of leadership and command. Unlike many of his fellow candidates who came from military families or ROTC programs, Halloway brought a different perspective to his training. He had spent his youth reading Steinbeck and Hemingway, understanding human nature through literature rather than through tactical manuals. His instructors noted that while he was competent in tactics and weapons, his real gift lay in understanding people and managing complex interpersonal situations. After graduating in the middle of his class, Halloway was assigned not to a combat infantry unit as he had expected, but to the Provost Marshal's office, the military police branch responsible for security, law enforcement, and prisoner administration. It was not the glamorous combat role he had envisioned, but his superiors recognized that the coming war would create massive prisoner populations that would need humane and efficient management. Halloway spent the next year at Fort Sam Houston in Texas, learning the intricacies of the Geneva Conventions, prisoner processing, camp administration, and the delicate balance between security and humane treatment. By early 1944, he was deployed to the Pacific Theater, initially stationed in Australia, where he helped establish processing centers for the growing number of Japanese prisoners being taken in the island campaigns. The work was challenging in ways combat never could be. Japanese soldiers rarely surrendered. Those who did were often wounded, traumatized, or convinced they had dishonored themselves and their families beyond redemption. Halloway worked with interpreters and medical staff to process these men, ensure they received proper care, and extract what intelligence value they possessed. He learned to see past the propaganda that painted every Japanese soldier as a fanatical enemy, and began to recognize the common humanity that existed even across the vast cultural divide of the Pacific War. As American forces advanced closer to the Japanese home islands through 1944 and 1945, the nature of Halloway's work began to shift. The capture of Saipan, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa brought not just military prisoners but also civilian internees. Thousands of Japanese civilians, many of them convinced by their own government's propaganda that Americans would torture and murder them, had chosen mass suicide over surrender. Those who survived, whether by choice or chance, required care, processing, and eventually repatriation. Halloway found himself managing camps that housed a complex mix of soldiers, civilian officials, and ordinary people whose lives had been shattered by total war. In July 1945, Halloway received orders that would define the final phase of his military service. He was to report to the headquarters of the Army Service Forces in Manila, to help plan for the administration of prisoner facilities in Japan itself, following the expected invasion. The planners were working on the assumption that Operation Downfall, the invasion of the Japanese home islands, would result in millions of military and civilian prisoners. Camps would need to be established, staffed and supplied on a scale unprecedented in military history. Halloway spent weeks in planning meetings, reviewing maps, calculating food requirements, designing security protocols, and trying to imagine the logistics of managing a defeated population that had been taught to die rather than surrender. Then everything changed. On August 6, news arrived that a new type of bomb had destroyed the city of Hiroshima. 3 days later, another fell on Nagasaki. On August 15, Emperor Hirohito addressed his nation by radio for the first time in history, announcing Japan's acceptance of the Potsdam Declaration and the end of the war. The invasion that had dominated Halloway's planning for months would never happen. Instead, American forces would occupy a defeated Japan and administer a population that had just experienced the surrender without invasion, peace without victory, occupation by the enemy they had been taught to fear and hate. The first American forces landed in Japan on August 28. Halloway arrived in Yokohama on September 2, the day the formal surrender was signed aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay. His orders were straightforward but daunting. He was to take command of a prisoner processing facility being established at the former Imperial Japanese Army garrison at Omiya, about 20 miles north of Tokyo. The facility would receive and process Japanese military personnel who were being demobilized from units throughout the home islands. Most would be screened and released to return to their homes. Some, particularly officers and those suspected of war crimes, would be held for further interrogation and possible prosecution. What his orders did not mention, because no one in the American command structure had yet realized it would be an issue, was that among the millions of Japanese military personnel being demobilized were women. Not nurses or civilian employees, but actual uniformed members of the Japanese military who had served in combat support roles, intelligence units, communication sections, and even in some cases combat positions during the desperate final defense preparations. The Japanese military had maintained strict segregation and secrecy around these women's units, and American intelligence had largely failed to document their existence. Halloway arrived at Omiya on September 5 to find organized chaos. The garrison had been partially destroyed by American bombing. Buildings stood with roofs blown off and walls crumbling. The infrastructure was barely functional. Water came from wells that needed to be tested for contamination. Electricity was sporadic at best. The Japanese army units that had occupied the base had stripped it of everything useful before dispersing. What remained was a skeleton staff of American military police, a few interpreters, some medical personnel, and the daunting task of creating a functioning facility from ruins. The first groups of Japanese soldiers began arriving on September 6. They came in trucks, on trains, on foot, columns of men in faded uniforms carrying whatever possessions they had managed to retain. The process was methodical. Each man was registered, photographed, and searched. Personal weapons had already been surrendered to local authorities, but the searches often turned up contraband, smuggled food, military documents, and occasionally items stolen from civilians. Medical screening identified those with tuberculosis, malaria, and other diseases that required isolation and treatment. Interrogation teams separated out officers, intelligence personnel, and anyone whose service record suggested possible involvement in war crimes. Most of the men were simply discharged and given travel documents to return home. The roads and rail lines of Japan were clogged with millions of demobilized soldiers and displaced civilians, all trying to reach homes that in many cases no longer existed. The American occupation authorities were trying to maintain order and prevent chaos, but the scale of the displacement was overwhelming. Halloway and his staff processed hundreds of men each day, a river of humanity flowing through the camp on their way back to an uncertain future in a devastated nation. On September 12, something unexpected happened. A Japanese army truck arrived at the camp gates escorted by a the MP sergeant in charge came to Halloway's office with an unusual problem. The truck contained 17 Japanese military personnel who had been found attempting to board a civilian train at Utsunomiya Station. They had been detained because their military identification papers showed them assigned to a signals intelligence unit that American authorities wanted to investigate. The unusual part was that all 17 were women. Halloway went to the processing area to see for himself. The women sat in a group under guard, still in their military uniforms, though these were worn and dirty from days of travel. They ranged in age from what appeared to be late teens to perhaps early 30s. Some sat with military bearing, backs straight and eyes forward. Others slumped with exhaustion or fear. None of them spoke or made eye contact with the American soldiers guarding them. The contrast with the male prisoners was stark. Japanese men, even in defeat, maintained a certain stoic dignity. These women seemed to radiate a different quality, not fear exactly, but a deep uncertainty about what would happen to them. Through an interpreter, Halloway learned their story. They had been members of the 47th Signals Intelligence Company, a unit attached to the Eastern District Army responsible for monitoring Allied radio communications. Their unit had been stationed at Mito, about 60 miles northeast of Tokyo, throughout the final year of the war. When the Emperor's surrender broadcast was received, their commanding officer had assembled the unit and formally discharged them, instructing them to dispose of all classified materials and return to their homes. The women had burned their codebooks and technical manuals, changed into civilian clothes over their uniforms, and begun the journey home. At Utsunomiya, however, they had been stopped by American MPs conducting security sweeps of the rail stations. The women had made the mistake of carrying their military identification papers, thinking these would help them prove they were legitimate travelers, rather than displaced refugees. Instead, the papers had identified them as intelligence personnel requiring investigation. They had been detained and transported to Omiya, because it was the nearest prisoner processing facility. Halloway found himself facing a situation he had not been trained for, and which his orders did not address. Were these women prisoners of war? They were uniformed military personnel of a nation that had just surrendered. But the surrender had already occurred, and they had been discharged from service before being detained. Were they criminals? They had served in an intelligence unit, but monitoring enemy communications was not a war crime. Were they simply civilians caught up in the chaos of demobilization, who should be released immediately? The answer was not clear. He made several radio calls to higher headquarters seeking guidance. The responses were contradictory and unhelpful. One staff officer suggested treating them as regular POWs and processing them like any other Japanese soldiers. Another recommended holding them for detailed interrogation about their unit's activities.
Preparing and narrating the story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
A third suggested releasing them immediately to avoid the complications of holding female prisoners when the camp had no facilities for women. After hours of conflicting advice, Halloway made a decision based on what he thought was both procedurally correct and humane. The women would be held temporarily while their unit's activities were investigated, but they would be housed separately from male prisoners and treated in accordance with the Geneva Convention's provisions for female POWs. The problem was that the camp had no facilities for female prisoners because no one had anticipated there would be any. Halloway ordered one of the intact barracks buildings cleared and designated for the women. He assigned 2 female Red Cross workers who were at the camp providing services to American personnel to supervise the women's housing and ensure their needs were met. He instructed his guards that the female prisoners were to be treated with respect and that any misconduct would result in court-martial. Then he sent another message to headquarters informing them of his decision and requesting further guidance. Over the next week, more groups of Japanese military women arrived at Omiya. Military police conducting sweeps throughout the region kept encountering women in uniform or carrying military identification. Some had served in communications units. Others had been employed in headquarters administration, logistics, medical support, and even air defense operations. A few had been members of what the Japanese called special volunteer units, essentially militia formations that had been training for the expected American invasion. By September 20th, Halloway's camp held 127 Japanese military women, and he still had no clear orders about what to do with them. The women represented a cross-section of Japanese society. Some came from middle-class families in Tokyo or Osaka, educated women who had volunteered for military service out of patriotism or the desire to contribute to the war effort. Others were from rural farming communities, sent into service by families who could no longer feed all their children. A few were from aristocratic backgrounds, daughters of officers or officials who had joined elite units that served directly under the army ministry. What united them was that they had all worn the uniform, taken the military oath, and served their country in its time of greatest need. Now they were prisoners in a facility designed for men, supervised by an American officer who was trying to figure out what justice and humanity required in circumstances no one had anticipated. Halloway began conducting interviews with the women through interpreters, trying to understand who they were and what they had done during the war. He was struck by the diversity of their experiences. Some had served in relatively safe rear area positions, working as telephone operators or file clerks in offices far from combat. Others had been stationed on the home island's coast operating radar stations and anti-aircraft guns during the American bombing campaign. Several had been at stations that were directly hit during air raids. They described crouching in bomb shelters as high explosive and incendiary bombs fell around them, emerging to find their facilities destroyed and colleagues dead or wounded. One woman, a former sergeant named Akiko Matsumoto, had served with an air defense unit at Numazu on the coast southwest of Tokyo. Her unit operated searchlights and provided fire direction for anti-aircraft batteries attempting to defend against the massive B-29 raids that had systematically burned Japanese cities throughout the spring and summer of 1945. She described the night of March 10, when over 300 American bombers attacked Tokyo with incendiaries, creating a firestorm that killed more than 100,000 people. From their position 30 miles away, they had watched the entire sky glow red. The smoke from Tokyo had drifted over their station for days. The survivors who fled the burning city along the coast road had told stories of neighborhoods vanishing in walls of flame, of people jumping into rivers and canals only to be boiled alive, of firestorms so intense they created tornado-like winds that sucked people into the flames. Another woman, Fumiko Tanaka, had been a translator assigned to an intelligence unit in Osaka. She had been educated at a missionary school where she learned English, and her language skills had made her valuable for translating intercepted American communications and documents. She described spending the war in an underground bunker, listening to recordings of American pilots talking to each other during bombing runs, translating their casual conversations about the destruction they were causing. She said the most disturbing thing was how ordinary it all sounded. The American pilots talked about dropping bombs on Japanese cities the way someone might talk about a routine day at work. They complained about the weather, joked with each other, discussed what they would have for dinner when they got back to base. The disconnect between the casual tone and the devastation being caused below had haunted her. A younger woman named Keiko Yamada told Halloway she had lied about her age to enlist. She had been only 15 when she joined a volunteer women's unit in early 1945. Her family's farm in Chiba Prefecture had been struggling, and the military promised 3 meals a day and a small stipend that could be sent home. She had spent 6 months training with bamboo spears and learning to operate a light machine gun in preparation for the expected American invasion. Her unit had been positioned near Kujikuri Beach, one of the landing sites the Japanese military anticipated the Americans would use. She described digging fortifications, preparing fighting positions, and being told that when the Americans came, she and her fellow volunteers were expected to fight to the death, killing as many invaders as possible before being killed themselves. The Emperor's surrender broadcast had reached her unit on August 15. They had gathered around a radio in their barracks, straining to hear the Emperor's voice through static and the archaic formal Japanese he used. When the announcement was finished, their commanding officer, a reserve captain who had been a teacher before the war, had stood before them with tears streaming down his face. He had told them the war was over, that they had not failed but that circumstances beyond their control had made continued resistance impossible. He said they should return to their families and work to rebuild Japan. Then he had dismissed them. Keiko had walked away from the military base, still not entirely believing the war could end without invasion, without the final battle she had been told would determine Japan's survival. As Halloway listened to these stories, he began to understand that what he was dealing with was far more complex than simple prisoner administration. These women were veterans, survivors of a war that had consumed their country and their lives. They had served not from fanaticism but from the same mix of patriotism, duty, economic necessity, and circumstance that had motivated soldiers everywhere throughout history. They had been prepared to die for their country, and now they had to figure out how to live in defeat. The question of what to do with them remained unresolved. Messages to higher headquarters produced conflicting guidance. Some staff officers wanted them interrogated thoroughly about their unit's activities and any knowledge they might have of war crimes. Others argued they should be released immediately as they posed no security threat. Still others suggested they should be held until a comprehensive policy could be developed for handling all Japanese military women. Meanwhile, the women remained at Omiya in a kind of limbo, neither fully prisoners nor free civilians. Halloway established a routine for their detention that tried to balance security requirements with humane treatment. The women were housed in their own barracks with female Red Cross workers providing supervision. They were provided the same rations as American personnel, a significant improvement over what they had been eating in Japanese military service. They were allowed to maintain their personal belongings and to write letters to their families. They were required to attend daily formation for headcount but otherwise were given considerable freedom within the compound. They were not forced to work, but many volunteered to help with camp administration, cleaning, laundry and food preparation, preferring to stay busy rather than sit idle. The cultural challenges were significant. American guards were uncomfortable supervising female prisoners. The women were equally uncomfortable being guarded by men, even enemy men. Halloway relied heavily on the Red Cross workers to serve as intermediaries and to address needs that the male staff could not appropriately handle. Language barriers complicated everything. The camp had several interpreters, but they were spread thin dealing with the ongoing processing of male prisoners. Communication with the women often required written notes passed back and forth, leading to frequent misunderstandings. Medical care presented particular challenges. Several of the women arrived with health issues ranging from malnutrition to tuberculosis to untreated injuries. The camp medical staff, all male, had to provide care while respecting cultural sensitivities around male doctors treating female patients. The solution was to bring in female nurses from a military hospital in Yokohama to conduct examinations and provide treatment under physician supervision. The women gradually came to trust the medical staff when they realized the care being provided was genuine and professional. One incident in late September illustrated the delicate balance Halloway was trying to maintain. A woman named Sachiko Ito, who had been a nurse in a military hospital in Nagoya, became ill with what the medical staff diagnosed as appendicitis requiring immediate surgery. The nearest surgical facility was at an American military hospital 15 miles away. Transporting a female Japanese prisoner to an American hospital for surgery required authorization from higher headquarters, escorts, security arrangements and coordination with the hospital staff who had never treated an enemy prisoner before. Halloway spent an entire evening on the radio and telephone making arrangements. Some staff officers questioned whether surgery was really necessary, or whether the woman should simply be released to seek treatment on her own. Halloway argued that she was in military custody, and therefore entitled to proper medical care under the Geneva Conventions. He finally received permission to proceed. Sachiko was transported to the hospital under guard, underwent successful surgery, and recovered in a secure ward before being returned to Omiya 2 weeks later. The incident established a precedent that the female prisoners would receive the same medical care as any other prisoners in American custody. As September turned to October, Halloway began to realize that the situation of the Japanese military women was not going to be resolved quickly. The American occupation authorities were overwhelmed with larger issues. Millions of Japanese soldiers were being demobilized. The country's economy had collapsed. Food shortages threatened mass starvation in the coming winter. War crimes investigations were identifying suspects for prosecution. The question of what to do with a few hundred military women was simply not a priority for headquarters. Halloway decided to make the best of the situation. If the women were going to be in his custody indefinitely, he would ensure they were treated properly and given opportunities to prepare for their eventual return to civilian life. He established an education program, bringing in Japanese civilian teachers to offer classes in practical skills like typing, bookkeeping, and English language. He arranged for the Red Cross to provide sewing machines and materials so the women could make civilian clothes to replace their worn military uniforms. He allowed them to organize their own daily schedule and activities as long as they maintained discipline and appeared for required formations. The transformation was gradual but significant. The frightened, uncertain women who had arrived in September began to show more confidence and initiative in October. They formed committees to manage their barracks, organize cultural activities including traditional music and poetry, and even started a small garden in an unused corner of the compound. The younger women, particularly those who had lied about their age to enlist and were now facing uncertain futures, attached themselves to older women who provided mentorship and guidance. A social structure emerged within the female prisoner population that reflected traditional Japanese hierarchies but adapted to their unusual circumstances. Halloway made a point of meeting regularly with representatives of the women to address concerns and explain decisions affecting them. These meetings, conducted through interpreters, were initially formal and stilted. The women were uncomfortable speaking directly to an American officer. Halloway was uncertain how to bridge the cultural divide and establish trust. Over time, however, a working relationship developed. The women came to understand that Halloway was genuinely trying to treat them fairly within the constraints of his orders and regulations. Halloway came to respect the resilience and dignity the women maintained despite their circumstances. One conversation in particular stayed with him. He was meeting with Akiko Matsumoto, the former sergeant who had served in air defense, to discuss a request from the women for access to newspapers so they could learn what was happening in Japan beyond the camp. During the meeting, Matsumoto asked Halloway a direct question. Why had the Americans treated them as prisoners when the war was already over and they were trying to go home? Halloway explained that they had been members of intelligence and signals units that American authorities wanted to investigate. Matsumoto responded that they were just soldiers doing their duty like soldiers everywhere. They had not committed crimes. They had simply served their country. Halloway found himself without a good answer. She was right. These women were not war criminals. They were not dangerous. They were simply veterans of a defeated army who wanted to go home. The only reason they were prisoners was bureaucratic uncertainty about how to categorize them and institutional inertia that left them in limbo while higher authorities dealt with what they considered more important matters. Halloway promised Matsumoto that he would continue to advocate for their release, but he could not promise when that would happen. In the meantime, he would ensure they were treated with the respect and dignity they deserved. Matsumoto bowed slightly in acknowledgement and said that was all they could ask for, given the circumstances. By November, the population of female prisoners at Omiya had stabilized at around 140 women as a few more groups were processed through the facility and some were released after completing interrogation. The camp had settled into a routine that worked reasonably well despite its improvisational nature. The women maintained their barracks, participated in education programs, and waited for decisions about their future. Halloway continued to process male prisoners through the facility while managing the unique challenges of the female population. Headquarters continued to promise guidance and policy decisions that never quite materialized. The approaching winter brought new concerns. The barracks housing the women had minimal heating and fuel supplies for all of Japan were desperately short. American occupation authorities were struggling to prevent mass starvation in Japanese cities where the distribution system had collapsed and food stocks were exhausted. Halloway put in requisitions for coal, blankets, and winter clothing for the female prisoners. He was told that supplies were limited and that priority would be given to American personnel and then to Japanese civilians in urban areas facing the most desperate conditions. Prisoner populations would receive whatever was left over. Halloway made the decision to divert some of the supplies allocated for male prisoners to the female barracks. He reasoned that the male prisoners were only held temporarily for processing before release while the women were being held indefinitely and therefore were more his responsibility for sustained care. He also quietly arranged for his supply sergeant to trade with local Japanese civilians, exchanging surplus military rations for fuel and winter supplies that could supplement official allocations. Such trading was technically against regulations, but Halloway judged that keeping people warm through the winter took precedence over bureaucratic rules. In December, nearly 3 months after they had first arrived, Halloway finally received definitive orders regarding the Japanese military women. A policy had been established. Women who had served in combat or combat support roles would be released after completion of a standardized interrogation process to determine if they had knowledge of war crimes. Women who had served in intelligence, signals, or other sensitive positions would undergo more detailed interrogation but would then be released unless evidence of criminal activity was found. All would be released with documentation identifying them as having been screened by and cleared for return to civilian life. The interrogation process began in mid-December. Teams of American intelligence officers arrived at Omiya to conduct detailed interviews with each woman about her service history, the activities of her unit, the chain of command, and any knowledge she might have of atrocities or war crimes. The process was thorough but professional. The interrogators were interested in documentation and factual information, not in accusations or harassment. Most interviews lasted several hours and covered the woman's entire period of service in detail. The interrogations revealed what Halloway had already suspected. The women had been ordinary soldiers and support personnel doing ordinary military work. None had been involved in war crimes. None had knowledge of atrocities committed by others that would be useful in prosecutions. They had simply served in the roles to which they were assigned, doing their jobs to the best of their abilities under increasingly desperate circumstances as Japan's military situation deteriorated. The intelligence officers completed their work by year's end and reported that none of the women held at Omiya required further detention or investigation. On January 7, 1946, 4 months after they had first arrived, the Japanese military women held at Omiya were officially released from custody. Halloway assembled them in the camp's main building for a final formation. Through an interpreter, he explained that they were being released and would be provided with documentation, travel papers, and a small amount of money to help them reach their homes. He thanked them for their patience and cooperation during their detention. He wished them luck in rebuilding their lives in the new Japan that was emerging from the ruins of war. Akiko Matsumoto, speaking on behalf of the women, thanked Halloway for treating them with respect and ensuring they were cared for during their time in custody. She said they understood he had been following orders and doing his duty just as they had followed orders and done their duty during the war. She expressed hope that the future would bring better understanding between their peoples. Then she and the other women bowed formally, picked up their few belongings and walked out of the camp gates into an uncertain future. Halloway watched them go with mixed feelings, relief that the complicated situation had been resolved without incident or mistreatment, satisfaction that he had managed to treat the women humanely despite institutional confusion and inadequate resources, but also concern about what would happen to them in a Japan devastated by war and facing an uncertain future under occupation. Would they be able to find their families in a country where millions had been displaced? Would communities accept women who had worn the enemy's uniform? Would they be able to build new lives after serving in a military that had been crushed and disbanded? He would never know the answers to these questions. The women dispersed into the chaos of post-war Japan and disappeared into history, their service forgotten, their experiences unrecorded, their stories untold for decades. Robert Halloway remained at Omiya through spring 1946, processing demobilized soldiers as occupation settled into permanence. The women's January release wasn't their story's end. Throughout spring, more Japanese military women emerged from hiding across the country. Each discovery created questions about documentation and screening. Halloway's improvised Omiya procedures became the template for handling these cases throughout occupied Japan. In his new Tokyo headquarters position, Halloway drafted standardized procedures for processing female Japanese military personnel. Guidelines emphasized rapid screening and release unless specific criminal evidence existed. They required separate housing, female supervision where possible, and cultural sensitivity around medical care and privacy. Procedures mandated documentation showing each woman had been screened and cleared, protecting against future harassment. These became official occupation policy by summer 1946. Other officers reported similar encounters. An Osaka captain discovered 30 hospital unit women living in ruins with nowhere else to go. A Kyushu major found disbanded anti-aircraft unit women squatting in former barracks maintaining military discipline because it was their only structure. Throughout Japan, thousands of women who wore uniforms navigated return to civilian society in a country lacking frameworks for acknowledging their service. Japanese society in 1946 struggled with fundamental identity questions. The military dominating national life for decades had been disbanded and discredited. The divine emperor acknowledged his humanity. Values shaping culture for generations were questioned under American occupation. In this upheaval, women who served military roles found themselves particularly disoriented. They had stepped outside traditional gender roles to serve their country, now returning to society lacking categories for understanding their experience. Many Omiya women came from middle-class families where education and modernity coexisted with tradition. Their military service had been understood as patriotic duty extension, acceptable because it served national emergency needs. With defeat and occupation, that framework collapsed. Honorable military service became something to hide. Women who wore uniforms found it easier to never mention that life part. They returned to families if findable, trying to resume interrupted lives. Younger women faced particular challenges. Those like Keiko Yamada, who enlisted as teenagers, missed crucial education and social development years. They'd been prepared for suicide missions never coming, trained to kill invaders arriving instead. Awabi as occupiers, taught death was preferable to surrender only to live. They constructed new identities and futures from scratch, often without family support or social services. Many disappeared into post-war chaos, their service unrecorded, and Halloway tried tracking some Omiya women, but systematic follow-up resources didn't exist. Occasionally he heard fragmentary reports. A Red Cross worker mentioned encountering Sachiko Ito, the appendix surgery patient, working as a Tokyo civilian hospital nurse. An interpreter reported seeing Fumiko Tanaka at Allied Translator and Interpreter Service helping with document translation. These glimpses suggested some women were finding ways to use skills and rebuild lives. The majority simply vanished into anonymity. Japanese record-keeping had broken down during the war's final chaotic months. Unit rosters were burned or lost. Personnel files destroyed. The Japanese government reorganizing under occupation authority had little interest documenting defeated military women's service. American occupation forces, focused on war crimes trials, political reform, and economic reconstruction, didn't systematically record low-level former military personnel processing. Women who served became invisible, their experiences known only to themselves and immediate families. In August 1946, Halloway received notification he'd returned to America. His Japan service had been valuable, but occupation duty was transitioning to longer-term presence requiring different expertise. Officers trained for temporary emergency administration were being rotated home and replaced by sustained engagement personnel. Halloway would be discharged from active duty and allowed to return to civilian life. He'd been away from home 4 years. Before leaving Japan, Halloway made a final Omiya visit. The facility still operated but had been reorganized as a repatriation center for Japanese civilians returning from former occupied Asian territories. Barracks that housed female prisoners had been converted to family housing for Japanese returnees from Manchuria and Korea. The camp where he'd spent months, dealing with unprecedented challenges and trying to balance regulations with humanity, had moved on to new purposes. His time there was already becoming history. Walking through the facility, Halloway tried articulating what the experience meant. He'd entered military service to fight enemies and defend his country. He'd ended up administering prisoners and trying to treat defeated enemies with dignity. He'd been trained to think of Japanese as fanatical opponents who'd never surrender. He'd spent months working with Japanese women, who turned out to be ordinary people caught in extraordinary circumstances. The experience hadn't made him question war necessity or American victory justice, but it had complicated his understanding of what those victories meant and what obligations they created. He thought about individual women he'd interacted with. Akiko Matsumoto, the former air defense sergeant who maintained dignity and bearing even in custody. Fumiko Tanaka, the translator whose fluent English sometimes allowed direct conversation without interpreters. Kiko Yamada, the teenager who lied about her age and trained to die defending beaches never invaded. Each had been formed by a society and war Americans could barely understand. Each had made choices within constraints invisible to outsiders. Each deserved to be seen as a full human being rather than reduced to simple enemy or victim categories. The experience shaped how Halloway approached remaining occupation service time. He advocated consistently for policies treating former Japanese military personnel as individuals requiring processing and reintegration rather than threats requiring indefinite detention. He pushed for standardized procedures providing consistency and fairness rather than arbitrary decision-making. He trained subordinate officers to recognize that defeated enemies were still people deserving respect and proper treatment under international law. His work influenced hundreds of policy decisions affecting thousands of Japanese veterans trying to return to civilian life. Halloway returned to Portland in September 1946 and was discharged from Army with captain rank. He returned to Reed College to complete his degree, graduating in 1948. He then attended law school, drawn by international law interest and legal frameworks governing armed conflict and occupation. His military experience provided practical context for theoretical study. He wrote papers analyzing Geneva Convention's application to occupation duties and prisoner treatment in unconventional circumstances. His professors recognized his insights came from direct experience rather than abstract theory. After completing law school, Halloway joined a Portland firm specializing in international trade and maritime law. His military service and language studies gave him advantages working with Asian clients in cases involving trans-Pacific commerce. Japan's economy was beginning recovery under American tutelage, and Portland's port was becoming a significant gateway for trade with the rebuilding nation. Halloway found himself working on cases bringing him back into contact with Japanese business people and officials. The country he'd occupied was transforming into a trading partner and ally. He married in 1951, a fellow Reed graduate he'd known before the war. They had 3 children and built comfortable middle-class life in Portland's suburbs. Halloway practiced law, coached Little League, served on school board, and became a committee His military service was known but not emphasized. He attended veterans events but wasn't particularly active in veterans organizations. The war was part of his past but not the defining element of his identity. For decades, Halloway rarely spoke about his time administering the Omiya female prisoner facility. The experience didn't fit conventional World War II service narratives. Combat veterans had clear stories about fighting the enemy. Occupation administrators had stories about rebuilding Japan. His story about trying to figure out what to do with Japanese military women who were not quite prisoners and not quite civilians was too ambiguous and complicated for casual conversation. When people asked about his war service, he gave simple answers about working in military administration in Japan after surrender. In early 1980s, this began changing. American historians started producing more nuanced Pacific War studies, looking beyond major battles and command decisions, to examine broader social and cultural conflict dimensions. Some researchers began documenting non-combatant and marginal population experiences. A University of Oregon graduate student contacted Halloway in 1983, asking to interview him about occupation service. The student was researching administration of Japanese prisoner facilities and had found Omiya references in archived military records. The interview opened memories Halloway hadn't examined in years. He described first Japanese military women group arrival, his confusion about handling them, the bureaucratic chaos of trying to get higher headquarters guidance. He talked about the women themselves, their dignity despite circumstances, their patience with an improvised system, their desire to simply go home and rebuild lives. He reflected on broader questions the experience raised about military service nature, defeated enemy treatment, and international law application in unprecedented situations. The graduate student's dissertation was never published, but the interview prompted Halloway to begin recording his own memories and reflections. He wrote a detailed account of his Omiya time, describing the facility, women he supervised, policies he developed, and lessons he drew from the experience. He included copies of documents retained from his service, including reports he'd written for headquarters and facility photographs. He deposited this material with Oregon Historical Society, hoping it might someday be useful to researchers. In 1991, a Japanese journalist contacted Halloway through the Historical Society. She was researching experiences of Japanese women who served military roles during the war. Japanese society was beginning to acknowledge that women's war experiences extended beyond civilian suffering to include active military service. The journalist had found Omiya facility references in American military archives and was trying to locate any surviving women held there. She wanted to interview Halloway about his memories of the facility and women he supervised. Halloway agreed to extensive interview series. He provided all documentation he'd retained and tried remembering specific individual details. The journalist was particularly interested in his descriptions of women's backgrounds, their attitudes during detention, and what happened after release. She explained that most Japanese women who served military roles during the war had never acknowledged that service publicly. Social stigma and lack of official recognition made it easier to simply forget that life period. She was trying to document these hidden experiences before all participants were gone. The journalist's work resulted in a book published in Japan in 1993. The book documented dozens of Japanese women's experiences who served military roles, including several chapters about those detained by American occupation forces. Halloway's accounts provided an American perspective on these encounters. The book included an Omiya facility section with information drawn from Halloway's interviews and documents. Japanese readers learned for the first time that American forces had detained military women after surrender and struggled with how to treat them properly. The book's Japan publication led to unexpected development. Several women held at Omiya in 1945 and 1946 contacted the journalist after reading about the facility. They'd never spoken publicly about military service but were moved to reach out after seeing their experiences acknowledged in print. The journalist put them in contact with each other, creating a small network of women who'd shared Omiya detention experience. In 1995, on the war's end 50th anniversary, several traveled to the former facility site, converted to civilian use years earlier. Halloway was invited to join them. At 78 years old, he made the trip back to Japan for the first time since leaving in 1946. The Omiya reunion was emotional and strange. The facility was unrecognizable, buildings replaced or renovated beyond identification. Women he met were elderly now, grandmothers in their 70s, remembering something that happened when they were young. They'd lived full lives in post-war Japan, raised families, built careers, contributed to their country's remarkable recovery and transformation. Their time in military service and subsequent detention had been a brief episode in long lives. Through interpreters, and with younger family members' help, women shared what happened after they left Omiya. Most had returned to families, if findable in devastated post-war Japan. Many had married, though often they hadn't told husbands about military service, fearing stigma or questions. They'd worked in various occupations, adapting skills learned in military service to civilian needs. Several had become teachers, others worked in offices, a few continued in nursing or technical fields. They'd lived through Japan's transformation from defeated enemy to democratic ally to economic powerhouse. Akiko Matsumoto, the former air defense sergeant, had survived war and detention only to die in 1967 from cancer. Her daughter attended the reunion in her place and shared her mother's story. After Omiya release, Matsumoto had returned to Tokyo and found work with an American trading company where her military discipline and organizational skills were valued. She'd married late, at 35, and had one daughter. She'd never spoken in detail about military service but had kept her uniform and a few documents hidden in a drawer. After her death, her daughter found these items and realized there was a part of her mother's life she'd never known about. Fumiko Tanaka had built a career as translator and interpreter, working with American military and later with businesses involved in U.S.-Japan trade. Her English skills honed in military intelligence work had been her most valuable asset in post-war Japan. She'd never married, dedicating herself instead to her career and caring for aging parents. She told Halloway through an interpreter that her Omiya time had been frightening but that his efforts to treat women properly had been appreciated. She remembered Red Cross workers who supervised the women's barracks and medical staff who treated injuries and illnesses with professional care. Keiko Yamada, the woman who lied about her age to enlist at 15, had survived to become a teacher. After Omiya release, she'd completed her education and earned certification to teach elementary school. She'd spent 40 years teaching children in rural Chiba Prefecture, never mentioning to colleagues or students that she'd once been trained to fight American invaders with bamboo spears and machine guns. She'd married and raised 2 sons, both with successful Tokyo careers. She told Halloway that she'd been just a child during the war, swept up in circumstances she didn't fully understand. Her detention time had been confusing and frightening, but looking back she realized Americans had treated her kindly considering she'd been an enemy soldier. The reunion lasted several hours. Women shared photographs from their lives, showed Halloway their families, talked about post-war years. They expressed appreciation for how they'd been treated during detention, acknowledging it could have been much worse. They understood that Halloway had been improvising within a system having no procedures for handling women prisoners, and they recognized that he'd tried to maintain their dignity despite confusion and uncertainty. They hoped their stories would contribute to more complete understanding of the war's impact on all people, including those whose experiences didn't fit conventional narratives. Halloway returned to Oregon deeply moved by the reunion. Women he'd supervised for a few months in 1945 and 1946 had lived full and often successful lives in a Japan he barely recognized from his service days. The defeated, devastated country he'd occupied had transformed into a prosperous democracy and valuable American ally. Women who'd been enemies were now elderly ladies sharing tea and memories with a former enemy officer. Wartime categories simplicity had given way to lived experience complexity and long-term historical perspective. In his final years, Halloway became more willing to discuss wartime experiences. He spoke at schools and veterans organizations about the importance of treating prisoners and defeated enemies with humanity and respect. He emphasized that people on the other side were not monsters or abstractions but individuals caught in circumstances often beyond their control. He argued that how victors treat defeated enemies shapes the peace following war, and that remarkably successful American Japan occupation had been built on foundations of fairness and respect for Japanese people even in defeat. He corresponded with several women from the Omiya reunion until his death in 2003 at age 86. Relationships were formal and limited by language barriers, but they represented closing of circles begun nearly 60 years earlier. His family donated his papers, including all Omiya documentation and reunion materials, to Oregon Historical Society. These materials have been used by researchers studying Japan occupation and Japanese women's war experiences. The Omiya female Japanese military prisoner's story remains relatively unknown despite its significance. It doesn't fit easily into standard World War II or Japan occupation narratives. American military establishment has never emphasized the story because it highlights confusion and improvisation rather than clear planning and execution. Japanese government has never embraced the story because it requires acknowledging women served combat-adjacent military roles, complicating narratives about civilian suffering and victimization. Women themselves mostly remain silent about experiences for decades due to social stigma and lack of recognition. Yet the story matters because it illuminates war and aftermath aspects often overlooked. Wars create countless situations not fitting established categories and procedures. Military war stations encounter circumstances their training and regulations don't address. Individuals must make decisions based on incomplete information and conflicting guidance, trying to do what seems right in the moment. How these situations are handled reveals character and values. Halloway's decision to treat women in his custody with respect and ensure their needs were met, despite bureaucratic confusion and lack of clear orders, reflected commitment to basic humanity transcending military necessity. Women's experiences themselves demonstrate resilience and adaptability facing dramatic social change. They'd been raised in a society with rigid gender expectations. They'd stepped outside those expectations to serve national needs during war. They'd experienced defeat, occupation and detention by former enemies. They'd then returned to a society being transformed by occupation and reform. They'd rebuilt lives in a new Japan barely resembling the country they'd grown up in. Their ability to navigate these transitions while maintaining dignity and building productive lives speaks to human capacity for adaptation and recovery. The story also illustrates how historical narratives are constructed and what gets remembered or forgotten. Women's military service was documented in Japanese military records, but those records were destroyed or lost. Their detention was documented in American military reports, but those reports were filed away and forgotten. Women themselves mostly chose not to speak about experience. For 50 years this entire episode was effectively invisible. Only when researchers began asking different questions and looking in overlooked archives did the story begin emerging. How many other stories remain hidden because they don't fit conventional categories or because people involved had reasons to remain silent? Japan's transformation from enemy to ally created conditions where such stories could eventually be told. Women detained at Omiya couldn't have publicly acknowledged that experience in the 1950s or 1960s without risking social ostracism. By the 1990s, enough time had passed and Japanese society had changed enough that they could speak without fear. Relations normalization between Japan and United States made it possible for former enemies to meet as friends. More nuanced historical understanding development created space for complicated stories acknowledging humanity on all conflict sides. Halloway's commitment to documenting experiences and making materials available to researchers ensured the story survived. Without his detailed accounts and documents he preserved, almost nothing would be known about Omiya facility and women held there. His willingness to speak with journalists and historians in later years provided context and detail that would otherwise have been lost. His participation in 1995 reunion created connections between American and Japanese perspectives on same events. His legacy includes not just policies he developed but historical record he helped preserve. Women detained at Omiya represent a larger Japanese military women population whose experiences have been largely unacknowledged. Estimates suggest several 100,000 Japanese women served various military roles during the war, though exact numbers are impossible to determine given incomplete records. Most served in support positions as nurses, clerks, telephone operators, factory workers producing military equipment. Some served in more direct combat support roles like air defense and signals intelligence units that several Omiya women had been part of. A small number even served combat positions during final desperate defense preparations. Almost none of these women received any recognition for their service after the war. Japanese government didn't extend veterans' benefits to women who served. No monuments were erected to their sacrifice. No ceremonies honored their contributions. They were expected to return to civilian life and resume traditional gender roles as if military service had never happened. Many found this transition difficult or impossible. Some struggled with trauma from combat experiences or bombing raids. Others found military service had changed them in ways making return to pre-war social expectations impossible. They had to construct new identities in a society providing no framework for understanding their experience. American military's handling of Japanese military women during occupation was inconsistent and often confused. Some units encountered women in uniform and simply released them on spot without documentation. Others detained them temporarily, then released after cursory screening. Still others, like Halloway's Omiya facility, held them for extended periods while trying to determine appropriate procedures. Lack of clear policy reflected broader American failure to anticipate or prepare for reality of Japanese women in military roles. American intelligence had documented women's auxiliary units' existence but hadn't fully understood their scope or integration into military structure. Geneva Conventions governing prisoner of war treatment were written with male combatants in mind. While they included some provisions for female prisoners, these were minimal and assumed women prisoners would be rare exceptions rather than potentially significant populations. Conventions required female prisoners be housed separately from males and supervised by women where possible, but provided little guidance on other aspects of administering female prisoner populations. Halloway and other officers had to interpret these minimal provisions and apply them to situations conventions hadn't envisioned. Experience influenced American military policy development in subsequent conflicts. Korean War, beginning just 5 years after World War II ended, saw American forces encounter similar situations with Korean and Chinese military. By then, clearer procedures existed for their processing and detention. Procedures drawing partly on lessons from Japan occupation. Subsequent conflicts continued refining these policies. By time American forces were deployed to Iraq and Afghanistan in early 21st century, comprehensive procedures existed for handling female prisoners and detainees. Procedures owing something to improvisations of officers like Halloway 60 years earlier. Omiya's story also contributed to broader understanding of how military organizations learn and adapt. American military entered Japan occupation with extensive planning for some mission aspects but with significant blind spots in others. Plan had anticipated dealing with millions of male prisoners and developed procedures for that task. It hadn't anticipated dealing with military women and had no procedures in place. Officers at tactical level had to improvise, make decisions based on best judgment and hope what they were doing aligned with higher level intentions and legal requirements. Some improvisations worked well and became formalized policy. Others were less successful and were modified or abandoned. Relationship developing between Halloway and some women he supervised demonstrated that even in imprisonment and occupation circumstances, human connections could form across cultural and linguistic barriers. Women came to trust he was trying to treat them fairly. He came to respect their dignity and resilience. These individual relationships didn't change larger occupation power dynamics or erase conflict history, but they did create small spaces of mutual recognition and respect. They showed even former enemies could acknowledge each other's humanity. Women's lives' long-term trajectories after Omiya release were shaped by multiple factors. Family situations mattered enormously. Women who had families to return to and who received support from those families generally fared better than those alone or whose families rejected them. Economic circumstances mattered as well. Immediate post-war years in Japan were desperately difficult, with food shortages, housing destruction, and economic collapse. Women with marketable skills or education could find work and rebuild lives. Those without such advantages struggled much more. Social attitudes toward women who served military roles varied across different Japan parts and different social contexts. In some communities, such service was seen as honorable patriotism and women were accepted without stigma. In other communities, women who served in military were viewed with suspicion or seen as having violated gender norms. Many women chose to simply never mention military service to avoid potential negative reactions. They constructed public identities, omitting those life years, sharing truth only with family or close friends if at all. Japanese women's movement emerging in 1970s and 1980s created some space for acknowledging women's wartime experiences, including military service. Feminist historians began documenting diverse roles women played during war, challenging narratives portraying women only as passive victims of male decisions and military aggression. This scholarship made it somewhat more acceptable for women to speak about military service. Still, many women who served chose to remain silent. They'd built lives on basis of never mentioning that past aspect, and saw no reason to change that in final years. Children and grandchildren of women who served military roles often knew nothing about that part of relatives' lives. Women hadn't told them, seeing no reason to burden next generation with complicated history. When family members discovered truth after women's deaths, finding uniforms or documents or learning about military service from other sources, they often felt shocked and disoriented. They had to reconcile grandmother or mother they knew with young women who wore military uniform and trained with weapons. This generational discovery has been repeated in countless Japanese families as wartime generation passes away and hidden experiences come to light. Halloway's decision to document experiences and participate in historical research set an example for other veterans. Many occupation duty veterans had similar experiences of encountering situations complicating simple narratives about enemies and allies, victory and defeat. Most never spoke about these experiences, not because they were traumatic the way combat was traumatic, but because they didn't fit expected military service stories. Halloway's willingness to speak helped create space for these more nuanced accounts. His interviews and writings influenced a generation of historians studying occupation and encouraged other veterans to share their own complicated stories. The 1995 Omiya reunion was the only time Halloway met any women again after their 1946 release. He'd often wondered what happened to them, whether they survived difficult post-war years, whether they'd been able to rebuild lives. Meeting them 50 years later, and seeing they'd not only survived but in many cases thrived, gave him completion sense. He'd worried for decades that perhaps his best efforts to treat them properly hadn't been enough, that they might have suffered additional hardships because of detention. Seeing their success relieved those concerns and validated his belief that treating defeated enemies with humanity and respect was the right approach. Women expressed similar reunion feelings. They'd carried uncertainty about detention experience for 50 years. They'd understood intellectually that they'd been treated well by wartime and occupation standards, but had no framework for evaluating whether treatment had been unusually good or merely adequate. Meeting Halloway and hearing his account of his efforts to ensure proper treatment, his struggles with higher headquarters to get resources and guidance, and his personal commitment to respecting their dignity gave them new appreciation for what happened. They realized their relatively positive experience had been due in large part to having an officer in charge who cared about doing right thing rather than just following minimal requirements. Omiya facility and similar occupation situations. Historical significance lies not in dramatic events or major policy decisions but in what they reveal about implementation and adaptation. Grand strategies and high-level policies mean little if not implemented effectively at tactical level. American Japan occupation success depended on thousands of individual officers and soldiers making good decisions in situations that hadn't been anticipated and for which no clear guidance existed. Halloway's handling of Omiya female prisoner population was one small example of this broader pattern of effective tactical adaptation making occupation work. Story also demonstrates institutional learning importance. American military's failure to anticipate encountering Japanese military women during occupation was an intelligence and planning failure. But once situation arose, military was able to develop appropriate responses relatively quickly. Procedures Halloway developed at Omiya were documented, distributed and became policy within months. This ability to recognize planning gaps, develop solutions at tactical level, and then formalize those solutions as policy throughout organization was one of American military's strengths. It allowed adaptation to unexpected circumstances without losing coherence or consistency. For women detained at Omiya and similar facilities, experience represented strange interlude in lives shaped by dramatic historical forces. They'd been children in 1920s and 1930s, raised in increasingly militarized society. They'd become young adults during war, contributing to national effort in whatever ways were available. They'd experienced defeat in occupation, complete overturning of world they'd known. They'd then lived through Japan's remarkable recovery and transformation into prosperous democracy. Their detention by American forces for few months in 1945 and 1946 was just one episode in lives spanning entire 20th century Japanese history arc. Yet that episode had lasting personal significance for them. It was a moment when their individual fates depended entirely on decisions made by others, when they had no control over circumstances and no knowledge of what would happen. Fact that they were treated humanely during that powerlessness period was something they remembered with gratitude. Several women at 1995 reunion mentioned they'd told children and grandchildren about detention specifically to illustrate that even in war, even between enemies, kindness and respect were possible. They wanted younger generation to understand that humanity could transcend conflict. Halloway died in 2003, outliving most women he'd supervised at Omiya. His Portland newspaper obituary mentioned military service but didn't detail his work administering female prisoner facilities. His family understood that work's significance from his later years' conversations, but to broader community he remained simply a World War II veteran who served in occupation duty. His contributions' full story existed primarily in Oregon Historical Society archives and in memories of a few Japanese women and their families half a world away. Women surviving into 21st century faced reality that their generation's experiences were passing from living memory into history. They were among last witnesses to Japan's transformation from imperial military power to occupied nation to democratic ally. They'd experienced multiple transformation layers personally. As they grew older and began passing away, they recognized documenting their experiences for future generations' importance. Several participated in oral history projects. A few wrote memoirs. Most simply shared stories with families, hoping this would be enough to preserve some record of lives shaped by extraordinary times. Omiya facilities where detention occurred no longer exist in recognizable form. Site has been redeveloped multiple times over decades, and nothing remains to mark what happened there. No plaque commemorates women held there or American officer who supervised them. Physical memorial lack reflects story's marginal place in both American and Japanese historical consciousness. It was small event in vast war, occupation footnote, complicated story not fitting easily into simplified narratives about heroism or victimization, yet for people directly involved, experience was deeply meaningful. Halloway considered it one of his life's defining experiences, shaping his understanding of duty, humanity, and obligations that power creates. Women detained there remembered it as strange but significant interlude, influencing how they understood their own experiences and war's impact. Their families, learning about this hidden history, gained new appreciation for relatives' lives' complexity and remarkable resilience they'd shown navigating dramatic historical changes. Omiya's story contributes to larger World War II and aftermath historical understanding by illustrating conflict dimensions that standard military and political histories often overlook. Wars affect everyone in societies waging them, not just battlefield soldiers or leaders making strategic decisions. Women who served military roles had experiences different from both male soldiers and female civilians, but equally shaped by war's demands and consequences. How these women were treated after defeat reveals something important about occupying forces' values and character and influences peace nature following war. American military's generally humane Japanese prisoners' treatment during occupation contributed to surprisingly successful relationship developing between two former enemies. Japanese people saw that despite wartime propaganda about American brutality, occupation forces generally treated them fairly and respectfully. This experience helped build trust and facilitated occupation cooperation. It created foundations for alliance that would develop in subsequent decades. Female prisoners' treatment was small part of this larger pattern, but illustrated same fairness and respect principles characterizing occupation at its best. Halloway's story demonstrates that war and occupation leadership is not just about grand strategy or tactical brilliance. It's also about how leaders handle unexpected situations, how they treat people in their power, and how they balance regulations with human needs. His decision to treat women in his custody with respect, to advocate for resources to meet their needs, and to push higher headquarters for clear guidance represented quiet leadership, never receiving recognition, but which mattered deeply to people affected. This kind of leadership in countless small situations throughout occupation helped make it successful. Women's stories demonstrate resilience facing dramatic social change and personal challenge. They'd served their country in ways violating traditional gender norms. They'd experienced defeat in occupation. They'd been detained by former enemies under uncertain circumstances. They'd then returned to society being radically transformed and had to rebuild lives from scratch. That most succeeded in creating productive, meaningful lives despite these challenges speaks to human capacity for adaptation and recovery. Their experiences deserve recognition as part of larger story of how Japanese society navigated catastrophic total war and occupation disruption. Long delay before this story began emerging into historical consciousness reflects broader patterns in how war histories are constructed and remembered. Stories fitting conventional heroism, sacrifice, and victory narratives are told immediately and repeatedly. Stories complicating those narratives or revealing confusion, improvisation, and moral ambiguity are often forgotten or suppressed. It takes decades for historical perspective to develop to point where these more complex stories can be told and heard. Omiya's story couldn't be told in 1946 or 1956 or even 1976 because social and historical context didn't exist for it to be understood. By 1990s, enough had changed that story could finally emerge. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up, just click and check them out.